Do you remember Bayonetta? Well, there's a third one coming out. It's out there on the horizon, if we can make it that far. You can't just say TBA anymore. Just make up a date that's set 7 years in the future so we can at least pretend we're gonna make it. I feel like the Bayonetta question, as it were, was never really resolved. Is this character an objectified sexual fantasy, or is she a feminist icon? Bayonetta discourse crops up from time to time, mingling highly intellectual critique with thirst posts and gender bending. I'm here to get ahead of the algorithm, manufacture your discontent, and stoke your thirst for video game feministology. Truth be told, I love the Bayonetta games. I think they're really tidy hack and slash games. Hack and slashers. But I enjoy them the way that I enjoy Terry's chocolate oranges, semi-ironically, knowing that when I vocalize my affection for them, I'll be met with an inquisitive cocked brow. You know the one. It's the only one that Western animators and TikTok cosplayers will ever use anymore. I'm losing my fucking mind. But nobody's criticism of the game has really adequately captured my thoughts on the subject though, so I'm gonna do that today. I'm gonna talk and you can listen. Back in 2014 to 2016, when this topic was more relevant and the debate was more nubile and buxom? I don't know. The most prominent feminist videos on the Bayonetta question were by Jim Sterling, H Bomber Guy, and Anita Sarkeesian. These people's videos weren't in complete alignment with one another. The verdict ranged from Bayonetta as a character having some redeeming qualities like agency, to some saying she was completely objectified and lacked dimensionality. There's perpetual disagreement about this subject between and betwixt feminists, and that's lasted as long as Bayonetta has existed. Then there are other perspectives. They're out there. I largely agree with the sentiments of these videos, and I have only really small quibbles about the way their arguments are worded. There are a couple of crucial points that I think are missing from them. I think it's useful to work with the arguments that they present for and against Bayonetta to work out what I think about the objectification or empowerment of Bayonetta's character. Before we get into that though, I want to talk about the concept of objectification, what it means, and all that good stuff. It won't take long, just bear with me, and for the love of God, before you leave a comment, tell me what you're wearing. What is objectification, and why does everybody argue about it? According to Timo Jutten, ho, a man feminist. Well, the convo about objectification reaches as far back as Immanuel Kant, before feminism was even born, and we still don't have a sure and certain understanding of what the fuck the word means. So, okay, let's do some thinking. Jutten's paper, Jutten? I feel like I do this a lot. I fuck up the J's. Jutten's paper is luckily a little more relevant than Kant's work because it's from 2016. There are, according to Jutten, a couple of common descriptions of objectification. Instrumentalization, developed primarily by a philosopher named Martha Nussbaum, who has ideas. She's not my favorite. This focuses on the way a person is, instrumentalized. This is when a person's personhood is drained and replaced with usefulness, a means to an end. Then there's the imposition account. In this version, to be sexually objectified means having a social meaning imposed on your being that defines you as to be sexually used. That's a quote, sorry. So, in simpler terms, this first one is about person-to-person interactions, and the second one is more about how, a wider cultural disposition is manifested by individuals. Wow, that did not make it sound easier. This is less about, relationships, and more about how we might invoke history, culture, all that other stuff, momentarily in our interactions with a person. Catcalling, for example, is an interaction between two people, but most catcallers probably know that they're not going to be getting the sex with somebody that they scream at like maniacs in the middle of the street. Instead, what a catcaller is doing is saying, hey, the women group are less human than the man group. For a long time, women were property for sex, babies, and passing land between guys. You know it, I know it, and I'm invoking that right here, right now. Except I'm not trying to broker peace between the Franks and, the Celts. Did they even exist at the same time? You'll probs notice the terms objectification and sexual objectification are used interchangeably, and for all intents and purposes in this video, they're synonymous, but let's adjust our definition a little bit to compensate for the sex part. Sexual objectification. I wrote objectification, that's fine. Is a process wherein a person's personhood, their personality, their agency, is erased or overlooked in favor of their role as a sexy vesicle for sexiness and gratification. Gratification of somebody else's desires, that is. Now, each of us probably objectifies other people in all kinds of different ways throughout our days. I don't care who you are if you're serving me tempura. I just want you to conveyor belt that shit into my mouth. So how can we judge when objectification's a bad thing? It's not when you just feel sexual attraction towards a person. When we decide to speak and act on our raunchy fantasies without asking for permission from the other person first, we're objectifying them. Think of this as our unrefined thoughts transferring to the way that we interact with people with no accounting for the possibility that they might say no. Because their desires, which may be to not be sexualized by us in that moment, are being ignored in favor of their usefulness to us as sex-gratifying things. I think acknowledging personhood demands that we pause our sex-starved porn storage box wires and invite people to opt out of the experience. If we do that, I think that we're recognizing that they have a choice and that they might say no, and they were not built by the human factory for us specifically and our specific use and pleasure. So number 2, did I say number 1 in the first place? I don't think so. When we view or represent somebody's sexuality as if it's decontextualized from their own will. Like, if we spot someone at the dentist and they're just getting their night guard fitted and we sexualize them, their sexuality has nothing to do with anything. Sexualizing someone in all kinds of weird contexts when they're not doing anything sexual or inviting you to see them that way imposes an idea on them that that's what they're here for, regardless of what they actually think or do. I might have diarrhea, but somebody assessing me as a person with diarrhea probably wouldn't essentialize that trait to my character. Diarrhea, sexuality, these are shifting, malleable parts of my identity that depend on context. What I've eaten, where I am, what I'm doing. Query! Aren't there worse things? Congratulations, you've been thinking about this for approximately 3 minutes. There are worse things in the world than being objectified by another person. Yeah, a lot of those things, you'll be surprised to learn, are linked to objectification. Assault generally stems from people not knowing where the boundaries are and buying into a belief that when they want it, they can have it, and the other person is just a thing to be taken when wanted. Query 2. It's not a big deal. Why are you acting like it's a big deal? I can't really explain how humiliating and scary it is when you're going about your day and you have another person either grab a part of your body out of nowhere or say some gross shit to you in public. It's humiliating, you feel like there's nothing you can possibly do to respond or protect yourself. If you don't think it's worth talking about though, that's fine. But then I wonder why you're still here on a small, irrelevant YouTube channel debating an issue that you're certain is unimportant. Leaving a comment or a dislike increases my engagement and gets me more views in the end. So does sharing it with your friends. So what about Bayonetta? What's the reason people say she's a feminist figure? Well, firstly, she's powerful. As she gets sexier, she becomes more powerful. Much of Bayonetta, the game, obviously, is feminist in theory. It centers around her relationship to herself and to another woman. The first game sets her on a quest, unknowingly helping her past self, becoming kind of like a mom figure to herself. It's sweet. Her character arc in the game is spiritual growth and self-acceptance. As she follows her course, she gains back her memory and a sense of self-identity. The second game is about her relationship with her friend Jean, but also with this little fucking guy. Jean is also a wom, not much to say, except that Bayonetta rescues her. Familial, platonic, and even romantic relationships between women are really scarce in video games, especially in comparison to the cornucopia of relationship examples we have between dudes and their women love interests. This is an aspect of the series that I think is overlooked. Women characters are often objectified in more extreme ways that tend to lack connection to anybody else outside of the man character that they're being romanced by, so this is a noteworthy aspect of the game. It's important to point out the good things in this case, because there's clearly a population of people who find this game to be an empowering example of a woman character. The thing about media analysis that you have to understand is there are very few things that are unequivocally, inarguably feminist. Like, there are tons of things that some feminists consider to be feminist and other feminists consider them misogynistic, and there are brutal, bloody academic essays published in the back and forth. The most complicated part is that the character was created by Mari Shimazaki, a woman? Well. This is not a kill shot against the argument that the game can be sexist in some ways. Women can be misogynistic too. Ooh. So I think just saying something is feminist because a woman created it is messy, and it's a thing that you can say still. What this does is reiterate for us what we already know. This is not the kind of thing that we're going to land on an easy answer for. So if we consider the text as a whole rather than little parts of it in isolation, like, you know, the game mechanics and the story and the marketing campaigns that accompanied it, etc., we see a picture that's greater than the sum of its parts. There's an argument that Bayonetta's sexuality is a more positive example of sexualization than a character like, I don't know, Bulma from Dragon Ball, because the game is self-aware. It winks and nudges and throws Bayonetta's junk at oh, it's always winking and nudging and throwing Bayonetta's vulva right in your face. She's sexualized on purpose, and that's the point of the character. I don't think this changes things in a meaningful way though, mainly because Bayonetta's power comes from how she's sexualized, not from her sexuality. Bayonetta doesn't really seem to have a sexuality. Like, she doesn't do coitus with anybody. She doesn't even really seem to be attracted to anybody in that way. When she flirts, it's usually just to joke around. It has nothing to do with her desires. Anita Sarkeesian points this out. Bayonetta's sexuality has nothing to do with sex. If anything, the game is about the sexuality of the player, being invited to look upon and enjoy the sight that they see. I think this is reinforced by some of the paratextual advertisements that were used to promote the game. People on subway stations in Japan were invited to peel off little bits of paper on a picture of Bayonetta until she was more and more naked. This was setting the stage for how we were supposed to interact with Bayonetta. It's not about this character's sexual empowerment, it's about how we, the players, are interacting with a sexual object that looks like a woman. So, of course, Bayonetta is sexualized, like, all the time. It's not a sometimes thing like my bowel movements, it's what her character is seemingly all about. Her speech is laden with sexual innuendos, her walk, her attacks, every outfit she wears. It's all oozing sexiness. I made a big deal about her relationships earlier, but outside of those, she doesn't really have a whole lot of dimensionality. Like, she's kind of prickly and reluctant to connect with other people, she's a snob, that's kind of it. There are rarely prolonged engagements with this character that don't sexualize her, which is a problem because, one, a character that is always sexy and sometimes other things is going to lack a semblance of personhood, and two, there's a gendered layer to this sexualization. Even though sexiness is such a huge aesthetic component of the game, it's a gimmick. You could substitute it with literally any other thing, and the substance of the game would be unaffected. Like, okay, imagine if instead of this game being about a sexy lady with magical clothing made of her own hair who used her sexiness to defeat her enemies, it was about a mathematics geek lady who spouted off magical parabolic formulas all the time. Using calculators and whiteboards, she defeats her enemies, and when she uses her magic, numbers fly off her spreadsheets and annihilate her foes. Imagine that, and now, if you've played the game, tell me, what changes about it besides the way that it looks? Maybe Bayonetta's dialogue has more math jokes instead of euphemistic sex puns, sure, and her ultimate attacks would have to have a different kind of theming where numbers fly around instead of her hair. But the essence of Bayonetta's gameplay, the world, the story, it's all unchanged. This is especially weird because, look, witchcraft historically is women's sexualities. Acquisitive women with voracious sexual appetites? They rode that broomstick D, and it wasn't a good thing, so we burned them. When you use a witchy aesthetic, it's logical that your story will probably be preoccupied with sexuality and gender, but these games are superficially interested in these topics, insofar as they serve as fruitful material for fan service and spectacle. Also, finally, the idea that sexy equals powerful is one of the only ways that women get to be empowered in society. Women don't get to be empowered because of their clumsy unsexiness. They don't even get to be empowered in spite of their clumsy unsexiness. Women are almost always defined by appearances, and they're good when they look good, which is so immature. These are very small parts of life. It's hardly where most people find lasting meaning. So I kind of wondered, how do I describe the essence of this problem? And then, obviously, I was watching an Errant Signal video about Far Cry 5, and Mr. Signal does everything right, and he points out that Far Cry 5 leans heavily on the setting that it evokes, its aesthetics, to inform its story, but as a whole, the game just kind of gestures to these big ideas about politics and culture without actually masticating on that sinewy jerky.
It doesn't want to be a game about fighting an actual secessionist religious cult because it doesn't want to make grandiose statements about the roles of religion or race or class in America, and it definitely doesn't want to talk about how those concepts feed into some of the country's collective ills. It's a game whose mechanics are entirely about making you feel like a cool shooty person, and it hopes it can skirt by using those ideas as set dressing while having a good time.
On the one hand, it does hint at criticism of the ideology that foments right-wing cultism. On the other, it never actually dives into that pool to engage with the lived realities of the game's real-world analogs. I argue that sexuality is to Bayonetta what Americana is to Far Cry 5. It's a flashy thing to look at. Like, okay, there's this scene where Luca watches a water droplet run down Bayonetta's titty, and it's the epitome of this problem. Bayonetta's just chilling. She's not soliciting this attention from Luca. Luca is gawking so openly that his body language is impossible to ignore. The fact that Bayonetta seems to not notice is just lazy writing. Also, Cereza is just in the background watching this interaction, and it's supposed to be, what, charming? The camera zooms super close to Bayonetta's nipple so that we can see what Luca's looking at from an even more stupid stupid angle. This is not teaching us anything about how sexuality became such an integral part of Bayonetta's character. It's not telling us why it's an important part of her self-expression, what satisfies her horny, you can tell that I've had sex before, right? Or why it's the source for her power. We're not seeing the trials or even the joys that she experiences by being a sexual person in the world, because the struggle for sexual liberation, as well as the benefits that come along with it, involve dealing with other people. Like, for example, some people can objectify you and treat you like a showpiece when you're just existing and hanging out. Or some people will assume that your self-expression is a form of consent and that they can act like fucking Luca. What we're seeing in this scene is an object of Luca's desire. We're joining in on Luca's titillation. Sorry for the pun. Bayonetta's character, her history, and her growth are completely irrelevant in this scene, and it's played off as a gag. The devs were trying to have their cake and eat it too. They wanted to take the things that are flashy and exciting about a sexy woman and sex itself without factoring in the most complicated part, the piece that's way more difficult to work around, the person. Consider this. Bayonetta might be gay. She might be asexual. She might even be straight. But because the game couldn't untether itself from
the male gaze,
it can only treat her as the object of Luca's desire, and based on the way the camera reacts when we see her, it's assumed that we're going to react the same way. Notice that Luca doesn't actually ask if she's into men. It doesn't matter to Luca whether she's straight or not. It just matters that he's attracted to her. So I'm sorry to everybody who's spent the last 6 years hating Anita Sarkeesian, but she's right. Sex has nothing to do with this game. Compare this to when Luca is introduced. The game kind of starts to return the same energy. Initially, he's presented as dashing and handsome, and dare I say it, the game objectifies him a little. But it almost immediately stops this. He's presented as a clumsy, goofy guy. In the same scene, he expresses a desire for this person too. So while he's sexualized, his sexuality matters. It's like the devs were uncomfortable positing him as a dude analog to Bayonetta. He gets to be somebody complex. He has desires. He has different modes besides suave sexy man. And when he's just existing, the camera isn't slimily climbing up his body, forcing us to look at him in a very specific way. Plus, Enzo, Rodin, and Loki are not sexualized. They get to be people with more dimension. And that makes this even more of a blunder, because women's sexualities come with a lot of baggage. And this dude side character's sexuality gets more detail in about 30 seconds than the female lead sexuality gets for the entire game, even though sex is her whole ass persona. This is why I say this sex thing is a gimmick. This game is trying to be about sex, but it's not. Now, somebody at some point will have stopped watching the video to comment, "Sex sells." This is not a response to any of the claims that I've made in this video, because this isn't sex, like I said. I didn't say anything about the market though, so like, are you saying this is about capitalism and gender? Do you want to say women's bodies are commodities? Is that what you want? That society treats women like products to make money? That Bayonetta's objectified, right? That women are treated like things to move around an economy? Are you saying that women's role is similar to objects? Hey, your eyebrows are kind of sweaty. Are you a gender communist or something? I wasn't talking about capitalism. You brought it up. Do you want to talk about it? I mean, you said that. Sex sells, not me. Nobody is saying that you're bad for liking Bayonetta. I like it too. But it's important to understand that objectification of women in a work of art can be a flaw, in the same way that janky controls or a glitch can be. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that this game would be flawless if Bayonetta's character expressed any desire to have sex, or if she had any other postures besides U-turn or pole dancer. What I am going to tell you is that the game would be a lot better if there was maybe a relationship between the mechanics, the style, and the story in the way that there is with, like, I don't know, Kill la Kill, which is not free of its problems, but at least makes an effort to marry its characters' stupid outfits and its cinematography with its themes. Self-acceptance and pride equal empowerment. Boom. Leaps and bounds more cohesive than Bayonetta. Now we can have butt shots and it means something. It's not even that this aesthetic is contradicted by the mechanics of the game. It's that neither of these parts of the game are harmonizing to make something more complete and interesting. And in doing that, it's also reiterating unhealthy attitudes towards women's bodies. We start to enter sticky territory when we use these images without thinking about why we're doing it. Partly because if we're not thinking deeply about what we make, we're holding our art back from being really good, but also because these images carry meaning with them outside of the world of the game. Objectification is an idea about the role of women in society, and it's built up by culture. And so this game is implicated in that process of imposition. It's a drop in the bucket of drops, or maybe it's just a reflection of the contents of the bucket. So there's no one to blame. Everybody's caught up in this world soup, stirring it as much as we're adding our own shit to it. Criticism has a very important role. It helps us to articulate all those different flavors of shit that swirl around in the soup of the world. Feminism is fundamentally a critical, theoretical approach. It helps us think about the ways that we stir the soup when we've been taught to not think about it. I respect games as an art form, which is why I acknowledge that they have the capacity to say things and invoke the culture that they come from. If this game were actually about sex, if sex had anything to do with the mechanics beyond sexy equals powerful, it might have been good. Thank you to my patrons for letting me play Among the Stars. Thomas, Sheldon W., Femi, Shreya G, Pat Healy, Eric, and best of most, Josie the Riveter. So these are the patrons. See them, know them, that they're better than you, and that you don't even measure up to them as closely in my esteem because they give me money. I'm kidding.